This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host, and helping take our leadership to the next level is Dr. Richard Blackaby.
Good to be with you, Sam.
Always a pleasure, Richard. We are nearing the end of yet another year.
Yeah.
Time is flying by.
Yeah, it does.
Like there's no tomorrow. But
yeah, I was thinking 2020 was not that long ago, COVID and everything, and now we're looking at 2024 already, where it's like...
It just seems... we
thought
think
we'd never get through that, and now we're kind of blazing on by down
there was
the
like a
road.
weird wormhole, I think, that was that time period that was both long and over in a blink somehow.
Yeah.
But speaking of years gone by,
nice segue there.
I do try, Richard. I do try. We haven't done this in a little while, but I always love to hear from you on leaders from the past, and we do these little leadership or leader profiles, and we're looking at one of the Henrys today.
Yeah, it seems appropriate. I thought we'd look at Henry V today.
How was it? Was there a total of 8 Henrys in the British?
I don't know of a Henry IX. France went up to Louis the 15th or 16th, anyways.
Yeah.
I think Napoleon and his crew took out the 16th or that time period. But I think after Henry VIII, nobody dared be called Henry again. But
that kind of fell out of fashion, I think.
Or no one thought they could follow in his shoes. But but this is Henry IV, and his father's
or
not surprisingly, or the fifth.
Okay.
Not surprisingly, his father was Henry IV.
You don't say. Is that how they did it?
Yeah. So they didn't spend a whole lot of time trying to figure out names.
Look, they've got
for the firstborn anyway.
There were other kingdoms to conquer. Like nobody has time for being unique with names and stuff.
Naming a baby. Yeah.
No.
Well, there's several things that are kind of interesting about Henry, and then we'll do another biographical look in a few weeks as well. And sometimes when you see a person that is kind of rated as a very successful monarch or leader or general, sometimes we think it's almost self-evident. I mean, we think, well, yeah, he was the king, so of course he did well, but it's not assumed that just because you're the king that everybody's going to do what you want them to do, or that you're going to be successful leading an army. And so,
well, I imagine that like kings or queens or just monarchies in general, that's got to be a slightly different sort of leadership than like someone who's like promoted to CEO or like it seems there's a different. It seems like a different class of leadership because there's all these other things that
and there's so many people
kind of go along with it.
Back in the day, Henry V is born in 1386, and so 1386, the 14th century, there's a lot of nobles in castles all over Great Britain, and they all are prideful and confident and thinking that they probably could rule things better than the king can. And of course, a lot of the kings they inherited the throne, and so they might just be a child. They might be 8 years old, and suddenly they're the king. And it didn't mean, it didn't necessarily mean that you're the king because you're the most talented young person out there.
Right.
That you're a brave warrior and a great general. You might not care anything about that, but you would assume that role. And so sometimes it's almost unusual for a young man to become king and actually to be a good general and to be good with leading and liking to lead. There were some kings that just wanted to be left alone to read poetry all day or to do all kinds of hedonistic pleasures, but they didn't want to actually govern their kingdom. And so sometimes there are just those kings who actually assume the throne, and they actually have the character, the skills, the maturity to actually do a good job. And so they kind of stand out. But Henry V, I was introduced to him reading a little while ago, and he was one of those guys who just kind of seemed to in some ways leave a bit of a charmed life, and but also he learned from the mistakes of his father, from others, and then he doesn't make the same mistakes. And you would think that should be pretty self-evident. Just kind of observe what didn't go well for the people who came before you, and try not to do that. But a lot of leaders don't learn that lesson, and you have a succession of people making the same mistakes. And so he's kind of interesting. He was born in Monmouth Castle, and so back in the day, you took the name of where you were born. So he was known originally as a child as Henry Monmouth, which made you really hope that you were born in a cool-sounding castle.
Yeah.
And his grandfather was actually a very influential leader in England, John of Ghent, who became quite wealthy, and he actually founded ultimately the House of Lancaster. And if you know about the War of Roses that would occur a couple of generations later, the House of York and the House of Lancaster would fight a very devastating war that lasted a number of years. And I actually have a book on that on deck to read here coming up, maybe at Christmas. But it would pull in these two leading families. Would kind of, you had to pretty well pick sides if you were a noble at the time, and it devastated the aristocracy for many years. But he's kind of this is kind of the beginning of the Lancaster family that will become quite prominent for a number of years. And Henry had three brothers, and one of the things that they say helped him be successful was that he got along with his brothers, and they were the kind of brothers who respected their oldest brother, and they were always loyal to him. And
much like your brothers, I would imagine.
Yeah, very similar. And I probably have a lot of characteristics like Henry V, but that helped him because in that day and age, you couldn't trust just anybody, and
Right.
you were always in danger of betrayal, someone trying to usurp the throne, and so if you had brothers you could trust, and they were throwing their lot in with you, so your success would be their success, and so he had three brothers that were loyal to him along with others, and so that gave him some lieutenants that he could entrust. And even after his death, they would remain loyal to his legacy and his wishes. But when Henry is a child, the king is actually Richard II. And if you've studied much of Shakespeare, Richard II is a famous tragic figure, and Henry V is portrayed by Shakespeare, and Shakespeare likes Henry V. He admires him for his success, and so he doesn't make Richard II look all that great. But Henry, I think he comes out. Shakespeare likes him and likes how he does things, and so Richard II, though, is he's a leader that has a lot of issues, and he doesn't want to be told what to do, which a lot of kings didn't. And so Parliament back in those days controlled the purse. And so if the king just kept spending money like there was no tomorrow, he'd eventually have to come to Parliament and ask for tax money and revenue, and that's when the Parliament could say, okay, well, before we give you money, we're gonna demand some changes. And if they saw maybe that the king had advisors that were not helping him show restraint, maybe they were encouraging excess, they would say, okay, we're only going to give you money if you get rid of that advisor or get rid of that general or whoever it was that Parliament didn't trust. And so there was always this tug of war back and forth. The king wanted to keep his prerogative, but he needed money. And so Parliament would try to exercise as many limits as they could on him. And so now and then things would get ugly, and either the king or Parliament would arrest people and even have them beheaded as traitors. And so it was a dangerous game, of brinkmanship. It was not just a vote of censure in the Parliament like it might be today. It was you had a falling out with the other side, and you could end up in the Tower of London. And so at a certain point, Richard II, he doesn't trust Henry IV, and so he exiles him. And this would happen sometimes. It was better to be exiled than put in the Tower of London. And so he goes to Europe, and but Richard II keeps Henry V, the son, kind of as a hostage. And so, but he's a noble, and so this boy grows up actually spending more time around Richard II, the king, than he does around his own father. And so he actually becomes quite loyal to the king, and he gets a good education and training, and it's kind of like, here's a way to kind of keep Henry's dad from doing anything too crazy, because I've got your son over down the hallway in the royal nursery if you give me trouble. And so eventually, though, Richard II kind of goes a little bit too far, and he tries to take all of Henry IV's castles and lands, and just tries to say that he's a criminal, which there's not conclusive evidence that he was disloyal, but that was kind of a thing kings could do sometimes if you were a little short of cash. Just call a noble a traitor, then take all of his assets and use them for yourself. And so he sort of just says, I'm taking all of your lands, which were pretty extensive. And so then he gets ready to go off to Ireland to fight, that Richard II does, to go fight a war over there. And at that time, Henry IV comes back to England, comes back from his exile, and says, okay, we're having it out here. You're not going to just rob me blind, and you're a corrupt king, and you're illegitimate, and you're not doing what kings are supposed to do. And so he rallies other disgruntled people, and there was always some that were disgruntled with the ruling monarch. And ultimately he gets his son, Henry V, ultimately joins his forces. But interestingly, at first it's not even certain which side Henry V is going to fight on, because he likes Richard II. And but of course he also has to be loyal to his father. And so very, very confusing early days for Henry. And you could certainly see how he could have been very troubled and confused, and not wanting to experience any more conflict. But ultimately, Richard II is overthrown, and he writes abdication papers, and he's promised that he can kind of just retire to one of his estates and just stay out of the way. And but then a month or so later, he dies mysteriously, which often happened. It must have been something he ate, but he dies. And so that, and ultimately Henry IV is made king. And so, and that always kind of hovers over his head, because technically Henry IV is not the closest heir. So if you were just going by who's next in line, it really wouldn't have been Henry IV. But he has to kind of make a claim for it. But, the problem when you overthrow someone, whether it's, maybe you run off a pastor and then you say, I'll just take over being the pastor, you overthrow a CEO or someone, is that you have to always be worried that someone's going to say, well, then I can overthrow you. Right. You're not a legitimate leader here, and so I can overthrow you and say you're not legitimate either. And so Henry IV always kind of lives under a cloud, and in the latter part of his life, he has some kind of mysterious ailments, and some people said, well, that's a curse of God on him, and so on. And he kind of dies a miserable, lonely, unhappy life. He becomes king of England, and he tries to do some things that need to be done in the country, but he's always somewhat suspicious of people, and there's people revolting against him in Scotland and Wales and other places, and so he actually will ultimately send his son Henry V to Wales and try to represent his dad there, and Henry V, actually his first major battle He's got armor as a knight, but of course the armor had like a visor and something to cover your face. And apparently, he got an arrow right in the visor, like it went into his forehead, and lodged itself in his skull. And I guess it tells you something of Henry, that he didn't want to leave the battlefield. I've got an arrow stuck in my head that came through my visor. I would probably want to call it a day.
Yeah.
And say, could someone call 911? But he actually leads his men to victory in battle before retiring from the field. And they are able to get the shaft of the arrow out, but the head is lodged in his head, and they have to do a very, very delicate operation that takes several days, and all of that without anesthetic, pain medicine.
Yeah, this is the 14th century.
Yeah, so you want to think about how
surgery.
Horrific that is. It took several days to try to loosen that shaft or the head from his head. But he survives it and lives to see another day. And so, but along the way, you'd also would have like a governing council, if you will, a group of your cabinet that would kind of govern the country. And Henry the Fourth brings his son in to be a part of that. So he. Early on, he's being groomed to be the king one day. And so even as a young man, he learns how to work with people and watches. And the council sometimes is, certainly the parliament sometimes is kind of hostile toward his father. But Henry V is watching all the time and learning. And when his father finally dies, he is made king. And the country, it's not very tumultuous or divisive. They embrace him as the next king, and they say that he was one of the most popular kings to rule England. That he just had a way with people that typically, if you worked for him, you remain loyal to him, and he could rule with a firm hand. He grew up to be a man's man. He knew how to lead soldiers in battle. He was a good warrior himself. He didn't kind of stay in the back of the battle. He was right in the middle of it, in the center of the army when the fight began, and that of course won him a lot of loyalty. He didn't kind of ride off in a royal carriage while the soldiers were marching across the land. He marched with them and endangered himself, lived among them.
Well, I think taking an arrow to the head in battle, I feel like as a leader, that's got to earn you some credit there.
Yeah, and he and when you survive things like that, you sometimes you think, well, does he have the hand of God upon him, the protection of God?
I imagine that story gets sort of embellished over as it plays telephone out among the people like that.
And of course, the worst thing, if you can survive an arrow to the head, was usually was infection.
Right.
You got an infection, then you died of that more than from blood loss and so on. But he survives, and several things they said about him that made him so good was he was a warrior and he was successful, and typically he didn't lose battles. He was used to winning, but he was very very confident, and he was able to instill confidence in the people that he led. And so even if his army was smaller than the army he was fighting, you just knew that if the king was with you, that you're probably going to win anyway. And at this time, he's going to eventually go to France and conquer France and become its king as well, which is quite a feat for a king of England. But at the time, the king of England was not nearly the warrior king that Henry was. And in fact, you didn't really want the king of France leading the army. He wouldn't have been very good at that. And so you'd kind of keep him safely tucked away somewhere while your nobles fought it out over who was going to be in charge of the French army. But the English king during this time was always with the army, leading the army. And because of that, he had total control. And there's no question about who do we obey the general, because he was the king, not some noble that was appointed. And they said Henry was also very good with governing, which a lot of warrior kings aren't. A lot of warrior kings are, they're so busy raising an army and going off to fight that they don't really take care of just running the country.
Right.
But he would usually leave one of his trusted brothers to run the country while he was gone, and he did a number of things to get good people in place. They said that he also, it was interesting. They said the author said, for a warrior king, Henry seemed also to possess the soul of an accountant, and so he's good at raising money. A lot of kings would run up huge debts by fighting wars, but he would raise money for his battles. They said that in today's currency, that he raised probably about 70 million pounds for his battles. So he raised a lot of money, and he would personally be involved with raising the money. He didn't just leave that to other people. He lent his name and cause and reputation to it, and he spoke with those who donated and or contributed, invested, and he was and he governed wisely. I think what you would just say is that he had a maturity about him, and you see a lot of leaders that are very insecure, and because they're insecure, they don't trust people that maybe could do a good job for them.
Right.
And they don't want to put really talented people in prominent positions because it looks bad on them. But if you're confident in your ability, you're not threatened by talented people, then you surround yourself with talented lieutenants that can do a good job, and you don't care if they get glory for it. That's you reward your people well, and so they want to perform for you. And so Henry had that ability to do that, and so he had some of the best people in the whole country that would serve him and lead in his armies for him and rule the country when he was away. And so it's just interesting, if you're confident and you have a good eye for talent, which Henry did. If he saw talent, he would reward you. And it's said that the author says that a lot of kings really saw themselves more as the king of the nobles. And so as long as you had the nobles under control, they would kind of keep the riffraff, the people at large, under control as well. But they said Henry was one of the first kings who saw himself as the king of everybody, the king of the commoner as well as the noble. And so even the commoners trusted him. And this is kind of an interesting time in English history, when they kind of developed what was called the longbow. And it used to be they had like a crossbow that was quite famous, but the longbow was kind of an English invention, and it could be shot really far, and it was very powerful, and a good archer could fire off several arrows every minute. And so when Henry became king, one of the first things he did was he outlawed selling longbows to the French or the Scots or anyone else who could be an enemy of theirs.
Yeah.
He kind of wanted it to be an English thing, and that became that was kind of like having the best Air Force at the time.
Right.
You typically, if you're going to fight a battle, you first send a barrage of arrows to sort of decimate the enemy as best you can, and those longbows could penetrate armor and could certainly devastate cavalry, and so it was just a game changer. If you had really good archers who could fire a lot of arrows in a hurry, you didn't have to have as big of an army, because you could quickly whittle down the other army to size. And so he encouraged longbow practicing. He encouraged every Englishman to have a longbow in his cottage that could be brought to bear if the king called upon you. And so he did a number of things, including building up a navy and protecting the English Channel, which was kind of one of the first kings to do that. Not again until Henry VIII did a king care so much about the navy and protecting his country. And so Henry is some people like Henry just seem like they were born to rule. That their dad didn't do all that great, but he watched what his dad did or didn't do, And then it was like he almost just course corrected with his family to say, okay, Dad did the best he could, but I think I could do better. And certainly he did.
Mark your calendars for May 15th to 17th, 2024. Richard is going to be at the Cove at the Billy Graham Training Center outside of Asheville, North Carolina. The seminar is going to be on the ways of God, and you can register at thecove.org. We'll leave links for that in the show notes. I will say, if you do sign up for the Ways of God conference in May, do let us know, because Richard would love to hear from you. He's not able to necessarily eat with everyone, but if you give us enough heads up that you're going to be coming and would love to have a meal with Richard, we will definitely do our best to get you on the list and at least be able to share one meal with Richard. So we hope to see you at the Billy Graham Training Center in May. Links to all of that will be in the show notes. I always enjoy these look backs through history and seeing how these great leaders took on the challenges that faced them, that were maybe both peculiar to them but also universal to anyone that leads. And Henry the Fifth certainly had some particular challenges, but also there's a lot that we can learn as leaders from how he led. So maybe just in the last few minutes here, Richard, what are some other things that you would like to point out about Henry V?
Yeah, just a couple last things. His most famous battle happens in Agincourt, which happens in 1415, and Henry has invaded France. And of course, Henry saw himself, or at least claimed that he saw himself, as the king of France as well. The English kings, some kings before him, had conquered some lands in France, and he felt like the French king had stolen some of his lands, and he was coming back for them. And
which it seems like there was just an ongoing, like sometimes the French would conquer the English, and like
that was an ongoing,
something about the French and English.
Well, and
it seems like more so than any other.
Yeah,
but
there was 100 Years' War. I mean, we think of them more in modern times, like in World War I or II, as allies. But for most of their history, they were not allies. Right. They were actually rivals. But he does a couple things. He invades with his army, and he manages to capture a major fortress, and especially back then, they would end up with a raging case of dysentery or something, or some other disease that happened a lot in close quarters, a lot of men living in close quarters together. And he lost a couple thousand of his men just from disease. He lost more men to disease than he did from the French soldiers. And so he's marching on, and now he's a greatly depleted force. He's had to occupy this fortress. He's had wounded people he's had to send home. He's got people died of disease. And so he's finally down to 5,000 or 6,000 men left. And now, after he captures this one big city or fortress, it finally rallies the French. And Henry is not he's not trying to come in as a conqueror. He's coming in as a liberator, to say, I'm actually the rightful king of France. And so he has a very strict policy about not looting the city, robbing people, because he doesn't want all the French to hate him and resent him. He actually, when he takes over a territory, he lowers their taxes, and he makes their life easier, because he wants everybody to like following him instead of the French king. And so the French finally rally, though. It's very late, but they finally realize, hey, we got to come together here and fight this invader. And so they gather a large army. And so Henry probably had maybe 7,000 men at most. And the French, it's estimated, had anywhere between 30,000 and upwards of as much as even 150,000. Wow. That 150 is probably pretty high, but they think that at the best odds was they were outnumbered 3-1 at the very best, and may have been at least 6-1. And so the French they're on their home territory. The English have been marching now. They're trying to get to Calais to get back to England, but they're several days' march away still, and the French send notice that they want to engage in battle. And so Henry says, well, you know where to find us. Here we are, we're ready. And so, but the French, you have to kind of understand what went on in that day, because you were looking for glory, you were looking for fame, and so if you were a noble, you wanted to be up in the fighting. You didn't want to be at a battle and you were always in the background, and then people say, "Oh, what did you do during that famous battle?" "Oh, I never really got close to the enemy," and so you didn't want that. So you wanted to be up near the front, and so Henry, the night before, they know they're going to probably fight the next day, and Henry dresses himself out in all of his royal finery. Instead of just kind of blending in, not making yourself an obvious target, he makes himself a very obvious target. He's in the very center. He divides into three groups, and he basically takes command of the center, and then his two most trusted, very capable commanders. And oftentimes you hear about, if there is kind of a defeat, sometimes you've kind of given charge of a major part of your army to someone that is not reliable. But Henry doesn't do that. He's got people he knows that they know what they're doing and they can be trusted. And two things that were kind of interesting I learned from this book. One is that the Englishmen, the archers, they would kind of keep the bowstring separate. Like, they didn't always have it all put together until they were ready to use it, and then they would string it. And so oftentimes they would keep it under their hat. And that was actually, the author says that's where the phrase "keep it under your hat" came from, was English archers that would keep the string in their hat until it was time to pull it out and go.
And is that to keep the string dry?
I think so. Maybe just not to keep it strung tight all the time. If you're walking for days with a tightly strung bow, then that could kind of wear it out. So you kept it kind of fresh, and you didn't really string it till you're ready to use it. So kind of like loading your gun in a sense. But and the other one was that the day that they're going to fight, apparently Henry tells the archers that the French hated the English archers, and so he said that the King of France had said that they were going to cut off 2 fingers from every English archer that they captured, so that they could never pull a bow again. And so when he tells them that before the battle, just know, if you get captured, if we don't win this battle, they're going to cut 2 of your fingers off. And apparently they had what they called the 2-finger salute, came from that, where the British kind of very irreverently would salute with 2 fingers as if to say, "Come and get him." And so that also comes from that battle. So anyway, on the day of the battle, the French come charging in, and the English archers just decimate the French, and the French. It's partly a problem with just pride and everybody wanting to seize the glory and get to the front of the line, which is commendable. You want to get to the front of the battle, but the longbowmen are just mowing people down at the front, and then they had about 1,000 cavalry that were going to try to sweep through and and wipe out the archers, but all of that goes to naught, and the English line holds. And it was pretty thin. I mean, they were greatly outnumbered, but the English also know they have no choice. I mean, they either win or they're going to be killed. So the French know that if things don't work, they can pull away and maybe strike another day. But the English kind of know they've got to hold the line here and not give way. And so they win an amazing victory. There's estimates are that there maybe was between 100 to maybe at most 500 English soldiers killed, probably much closer to 100. And yet there were literally thousands of Frenchmen that died. And what happens is that so many bodies, they were literally just French bodies just piled up in heaps in front of the English. And then some were actually just trapped. You turned to flee, and there's so many corpses behind you. You couldn't escape. And so it was a horrific massacre. And probably the worst part for the French was that there were perhaps 1,200 or more French nobles that were captured and taken away as prisoners, and many, many more that were killed in battle. Many dukes and nobles of various ranks were killed in that battle. It was devastating to the French. And so Henry comes back the next year, and then he begins just to claim more and more territory of France. And finally, the French have to capitulate to him, and he marries a French princess, and basically he becomes the regent as long as the current French king is around. He'll rule France, but kind of with the authority over the king. And then when the king dies, he becomes the king of France. And so he is. I don't think it gets any better for an English king than when you whoop up on France and you become the king of France as well.
Yeah.
And he does some things. He says, okay, we're not going to just merge the two countries. They'll continue to be separate countries. If you're France, we won't try to teach you how to be English. You'll still be France, but we'll just have the same king, which is absolutely phenomenal that he could do that. But he is going to get ill, going to catch disease, which so many famous generals did while out. Like Alexander the Great some think he was poisoned, others say he just caught malaria or something and died. But he's going to ultimately die and have his body brought back to England. That people mourned him, even though he was away a lot. He had learned to make English men feel like they were English, that they felt proud of who they were and their country and their victories and their king. And so he manages to have a son with this French princess that he's married. And for the first while, his brothers are going to take over until his son gets old enough to rule. But and his one brother John is quite competent as well. But as long as his brothers and his chief lieutenants are still around, it says something about Henry that those who serve with him, even after he's dead, they continue to promote his legacy, his reputation. Mm-hmm. They try to keep fulfilling his will, what he wanted done. They try to make it so. But as they begin to die off, the next generation, including Henry's son, just isn't his father. And sadly, within 30 years, all the territory that Henry conquered will be lost. And there'll become a horrific war of roses that will decimate the Lancaster family. And so you look at his time frame and you just say, it didn't last long. A lot of what he gained was lost soon afterward. But he did instill certain pride in his nation. He built his navy. He showed that how strong an English army could be, especially with archers. But he dies prematurely, and so like a lot of questions in history, you kind of wonder, what if he had lived another 20 years, ruled France for 20 more years? He's one of those leaders that as long as he lived, nobody could really beat him. And the only thing that beat him was disease and his own mortality. But an interesting king. Shakespeare, if you get a chance to look at his plays, Henry, I think, shows up in a couple of different plays. But Shakespeare quite admired him as one of the heroes. And maybe the last thing to say is that when during World War II, when the British and the Americans and Canadians finally invaded Normandy and were slugging it out with the Germans there on the mainland, Churchill actually insisted that England produce a film on Henry V, because it was in the area of Normandy that he fought his battles and where he invaded France. And so he called upon Englishmen to remember Henry V that had been so successful in fighting in that same territory several centuries earlier. Wow. And so you might not have heard a lot about Henry V before. We always hear about Henry VIII, but sometime before that, Henry V is one of those guys who history has treated pretty well overall, and said, we wish we'd had more national leaders like him.
Yeah, and tell us again the book that you referenced.
Yeah, it's by Teresa Cole. It's called Henry V, The Life of the Warrior King and the Battle of Agincourt. So it's not as deep of a book as some get real academic sometimes and really get into deep footnotes. She writes it a little bit more popularly. And she'll describe things like the longbow and how it worked, or armor at that time and what it protected, what it didn't, and just kind of how you'd raise money to carry out a war. And so it's quite informative for that time period. I'm guessing a lot of our listeners haven't read anything about the history of the 14th century anytime recently, and so might be time. You might be past due.
It might be. So we'll leave links to that in the show notes. And until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.